Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Safety. I'm your host, Dylan Sutherland from Protector Safety Gear. Throughout this series, we'll be interviewing industry experts to provide our audience with valuable insights on various categories of PPE. Topics will range from selection and standards to maintenance and care. This should ultimately assist you in selecting fit-for-purpose safety solutions for your site. From these discussions, we will create resources such as Toolbox Talk downloads and blogs, all of which will be available on our website, www.protector.co.za, for download. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Safety. Today, I'm quite excited. It's the final episode of the season. We're sitting here with Jarryd Swanepoel. Jarryd is the National Sales Manager for Uvex. Jarryd, give us a bit of a background. So you were born, you went to school, you're now here. What happened in between?
Indeed. I was born, I did go to school. And I think the last 10 years I've been at Uvex Safety. So just being able to get out into industry, and the beauty of being in PPE and being at Uvex specifically. I mean, Uvex has got a very good appetite for protecting people. It stems from the bottom right through the whole culture of the business. And we almost have a free pass in this industry, you will know the same, to get into other businesses of all sorts, whether they're building cars or mining underground. We get to see a bit of everything as we go. So as an introduction, I think just 10 years in the industry, the title is less important. It's more just we've been able to learn and see other businesses and what kind of challenges they face. And what we try and do is look at the problems that they face and solve those problems. So essentially that's our role.
Fantastic. And I mean, from an outside perspective, which I mean, it's generally pretty difficult, us as Protector sees Uvex as one of those companies that aligns closely with our viewpoint of fit for purpose. We don't just want to tick a box. We don't just want to say, hey, we kept someone safe, kind of. We want to make sure that that person is appropriately protected, that they can carry on earning the bread that they need to for their family, for the next 20, 30 years. That's how we perceive Uvex. I mean, how do you see you guys as fit for purpose?
Now, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. So often as a manufacturer of product, we talk about the product, or we talk about the standards, the way the product is tested, manufactured, its materials, and how it performs within laboratory environments. And when you think about the reality, how the end user needs to wear that product, what type of applications they face, the varying different kind of environments that one product is used in comparison to the tests or the laboratories in controlled environments. I think this topic is probably the one where that relationship of product and standards versus reality and how it's been implemented is particularly interesting.
I mean, I've had the pleasure of dealing with you in a couple situations with customers, and I think what you're alluding to, as in this episode, is we're talking about hearing protection, and I think what I've seen from you is a huge amount of passion regarding that topic, which is why we've asked you to join us, because, I mean, it's all good and well, again, saying we're going to protect somebody. When somebody has passion on a subject, it's a lot more visible to the user, and the probability of keeping them safe, I think, takes a bigger step forward, which we love that from your support in this instance. I think to start off the topic, I mean, we're doing a general on hearing protection. Let's maybe give a start at the standards and regulations. Where do you see it from a South African point of view currently? What are you experiencing from that topic?
Okay, just on the first comment with regards to the passion, I think, throughout my 10 years in the industry, I think hearing protection has stood out as one problem that industry and safety professionals are really scratching their heads on, because we're seeing a big decline in injuries across the board, head to toe, because of measures put in place by safety professionals, applying the hierarchy of controls and eliminating hazards. But hearing protection particularly, we're not seeing that trend. So Dr. Balfour at last year's Mining in Durban announced that noise-induced hearing loss has now in fact superseded tuberculosis and silicosis as the leading health concern in South African industry. Okay, what we see on the ground is we see the standards, we see the regulations, and we see the efforts made by the people putting them in place to make them practical. but we see a disconnect to the very end user. Okay, so the injuries are still there. It's the most common occupational injury in the world, and in South Africa in particular, it's the one that's decreasing at the slowest rate. So it's still a very big problem. And the reason why the passion developed is because you can see on ground level, not to oversimplify things, but it's actually a very easy problem to fix practically. If I were to simply block my ear with my finger, I can prevent noise-induced hearing loss. Obviously, that's not practical because I need my hands to work. Okay. When we talk, we can introduce the standards now. I'm going to perhaps start with from a product point of view and then look at the regulations around that. But in South Africa, the standard pre-2008 was SANS 1451. That changed in 2008 for many reasons. It was established originally in 1988, which happens to be my birth date, so I can tell you it's been getting old. So it was dated, but also the testing locally, so that the speed at which the materials improved, the products improved, and the way that the standard was applied, there was a bit of a difference between staying up to date with how do we ultimately protect the end user as best as possible, and also our facilities locally in terms of testing those products that were then coming in. So the decision by the technical committee of the SABS was then to adopt the EN standard, which is a more comprehensive standard and I think more all-encompassing when it comes to hearing protection. So the EN standard 352 was adopted under SANS 50352. And then within that, and we'll get into that I think in different episodes, is the subcategories 1 through 8, depending on the type of product that's being tested in the subcategories. So that's the product itself. But if we look at occupational safety, the employer and the employee's responsibilities really come in with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or if you're in the mining sector, the Mine Health and Safety Act. And that's where there's now specifically, so different to, say, eye protection. You don't just have a product standard, which is the appropriate one to look at when selecting product for your workforce. You also have input from Department of Labor on something of a requirement checklist. Where do I start? What do I do to achieve effective hearing protection within my business?
It's interesting. So my background, as you know, is generally fall protection. I mean, that's where I started my safety, and I'm glad that it's evolved from there. And it's really interesting getting into it. But there's quite an interesting dynamic in the safety that how it works for fall protection isn't necessarily eye protection, isn't necessarily hearing, like you've alluded to now, between hearing and eye protection. But one consistent is the lack of knowledge from the standards point of view. Now you're saying that there's an additional step to that with the Department of Labor having a checklist as such. Can you do you think that's something that gets followed properly?
If I go to 10 different end users in South African industry, I typically could ask a question, if your average noise level is 100 decibels, what do you do about it? I could get 10 different answers. And that's not necessarily because of the effort or the work put in place by Department of Labor, which is really the Occupational Health and Safety Act itself, because it is the one category where they do go into a bit of detail. All right, similarly to respiratory. So I think it's a general education that's filtering through to the end user level, and building those habitual practices of understanding how does the ear work? What do I need to do to protect myself? And then implementing that. So to understand it in theory at a top level is possible, but to instill those behaviors. So what we try and do is, when we go out and we do our hearing conservation training, is we try to talk very much layman's terms. We try to introduce different languages, and we try to get the very basics through to the end user, the person that needs to ultimately take that onus onto himself.
Yep.
All right. So it's one thing having the rules in place. It's another one, or it's another thing having them effectively implemented. So there is a bit more detail and a bit more knowledge available, but how it's implemented to the very end level is the challenge.
Yeah,
Education.
and I think so. I mean, if you think about any instance where somebody gets injured, that's what I've. It's not a nice part of fall protection, but it's a solid way to drive the message home because when you fall, you immediately see the injury.
Hmm.
How does it work with hearing? How long does that injury take?
Good question. So when we arrive on at an end user site, the first and foremost things you're thinking about are the tangible, obvious injuries that could take place, right? So my footwear, I need to have good shoes with a safety toe cap, and my gloves, because whatever work I'm going to be doing today, these are the first kind of parts of my body that are going to get involved. I'm going to work with my hands. And it's entirely not the case. Your ears never switch off,
Yeah.
right? If you're fast asleep or you're at work, your ears are working, right? If I clap my hands next to you while you're asleep at night, you're going to wake up.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a similarly sometimes correlating to respiratory is it's something that happens over time. It's not instant, immediate, and visible, and doesn't always cause pain. In fact, sometimes the reverse happens. So if you're exposed to 85 decibels or more over an 8-hour shift, theoretically you're losing your hearing, okay? You're not going to feel pain while that's happening. And to protect yourself essentially comes along with some inconveniences, all right? Nobody wakes up on a Saturday and says, I'm going to put on my tackies today because they're comfortable. And along with that, I'm going to insert an earplug into my ear because it's comfortable, right? We promote PPE, but we understand. I mean, the earplug is the only piece of PPE that's intrusive, that goes into your body.
Yeah.
It's not comfortable, right? So we've got to maximize the knowledge to the end user level, and we've got to plug into that the practical considerations. So many employers will say, okay, let's achieve compliance. Let's go for the maximum protection for everybody, and I can tick a box. And theoretically in a calculation, yes, that earplug should bring you to a place of safety. However, how that earplug is inserted by the individual, right? If you were to put in an earplug, you're already imagining, okay, 4 hours, 5 hours from now, I may need to remove it.
Yeah.
So if it's a larger earplug that creates a seal in the ear, removing it is also not comfortable.
Yeah.
You know, there's a seal there. There's a soft, we call it your tympanic membrane. It's essentially your eardrum and the inner ear behind that. If I remove the earplug, something's going to give. And typically the softest material being the eardrum, there would be some discomfort.
Yeah.
So subconsciously we know all these things. Subconsciously we don't know what's happening to us if we're not doing these things. So finding the balance between protection and comfort sometimes are counterintuitive.
Yeah.
You got to find that perfect balance. Getting your calculation right, and I think we'll touch on that shortly, but having the calculation right to the point of protection whilst achieving maximum comfort and practicality is the kind of the sweet spot.
So there's quite an interesting concept that I don't think I've thought about prior to this discussion. You're 100% right. I mean, you put your earplug in, you pull it out, and it creates this suction, which is going to be applied to your eardrum. Now, the opposite in my mind is true, that I'm nervous because I'm by nature, I'm a hyper safety focused person. I don't want to get hurt unnecessarily. So I'm generally quite precautious. And with that in mind, all I was thinking when you're explaining that is, or I insert this earplug too deep. Is that a probability? I don't know if that's something that's discussed often.
So underneath the requirements of the standard 50352, the dimensions of the product is one of them, right? So you're never going to find an earplug that's essentially this long, because you got to manufacture within certain guidelines.
Okay.
And the length of the earplug should never be such that if it's inserted properly deep enough, it's going to be colliding with the eardrum.
Okay. So it shouldn't be
we should rather aim for a deeper insertion than a shallow one.
Okay.
Because you need to achieve that seal.
Okay, great. So with that in mind, I mean, how does this become something practical for a person responsible for those safety on site?
Sure. So essentially, and we're working on something that perhaps you can put into one of your toolbox talks. We're also working on a document which is essentially a South African perspective or guidelines to effective hearing protection. Something of a checklist. What steps can we follow to summarize those responsibilities in the acts and to arrive at a point where not only do you have compliance, but it's effective. It's something that you can implement practically. The first place to start, and similarly with all other products or product groups, is the risk assessment. You need to identify the source of the noise, all right? And once you've done that, you can obviously apply your hierarchy of controls. So that means essentially almost always PPE should be seen as your last resort.
Yeah.
As mentioned earlier, it's more comfortable to go to work in your running shoes and your running shorts, but we need to protect ourselves. Almost always the engineering controls would still leave some degree of risk in the industrial setting. So identify the source of the noise. Applying the hierarchy of controls is now important in the sense that, let's go with a simple example of a factory that manufactures clothing. Let's say they use a generator to produce some power. They then have a sewing machine, and then they also have people folding and packing the stock. So in that environment, you would have two different noise sources. You would have the generator itself, and you'd have the sewing machine. So once you've identified them, applying the hierarchy of controls is saying, okay, what can we do to eliminate this noise? Now, you can't eliminate the noise of a generator. It needs to work to produce power, but you can eliminate it from the environment because no one needs to physically operate that machine. So that can be moved outside, with perhaps some sound dampening. The power will come through into the building through a cable.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one solution to reducing the exposure. Then you've got the sewing machine. They can get pretty loud. That's going to need some manual operating. Okay, you've got the fabric, you'll need someone operating that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say this is producing 100 decibels. Okay, hierarchy of controls will now say, okay, before you go to the last step of PPE, what can we do to eliminate this or reduce this noise? Or perhaps you could rotate staff. Could you train up the people folding and packing to also operate the machine? And instead of having one person operate the sewing machine, you could have 3 that then rotate, reducing their exposure of 8 hours per day to that divided by 3, essentially, which will reduce the risk of injuries. But still, the machine will be producing noise.
Yeah.
Okay, so the administrative controls have been put in place with rotation. You still have a problem. You still need to now protect from the hazard, and that's now unavoidable. We look at PPE. The next step essentially would be the noise assessment. So this is where you physically need to record the noise levels that you have in the setting, so the residual noise level, and you need to know exactly what that number is. So per department, if your business has got different departments, you need to have a time-weighted average noise level per department. Okay, so in this case, we've just got the one problem of the sewing machine. We need to record that noise, and that has to be done by a qualified person, an occupational hygienist, who's got the certification to operate the audiometer, let's say the equipment to record that noise. And that list is published on the Department of Labor's website. Approved inspection authorities, you can reach out to any of them. They can come and do that assessment, and that has to be done every 2 years. Okay, so essentially that's step 2. Step 3, you now know exactly what the noise level is, and you need to select the hearing protection device itself. So when considering the hearing protection device itself, you have to make sure, as we spoke about earlier, this product has to be compliant to the EN 352 or SANS adopted standard 50352. So regardless whether that ends up being an earplug, an earmuff, a customized molded earplug, whatever it is, it needs to comply to that standard. All right, that's your step number 3 on the checklist. So essentially other products will be allowed into country. You get a wide array of product for musicians, the scope is wide. You can't have a complete control of what enters the country.
Yeah.
So make sure the appropriate standard is selected.
And that's quite simple from a point of they can see the standard probably marked on the product or in the casing that it's come in?
Correct. So according to the standard, there are certain markings that have to be there. So EN352 will have to be present on the packaging.
Fantastic.
Okay. So on the product, you got the product itself. Now we go to step number 4. And this is the one where I alluded earlier. If I ask 10 different employers, your scenario is you have 100 decibels as your noise level. What SNR, we're going to explain SNR now, but what attenuation or protection factor should you be buying or supplying your workforce? And that's where we get different answers, okay? Because you've got American laws, you've got EN laws, you've got South African, which doesn't pinpoint this particular calculation, okay? Talks about a lot of practical factors to consider, which is brilliant, but the exact calculation we refer to as the EN SNR calculation, single number rating calculation, which effectively will say, all right, this product has been tested in controlled environment whereby they'll have 16 candidates. They'll play them certain noises across different frequencies. They will then give them the product, let's go with an earplug, and they will play those same noises the exact same way as before, and they will need to record by how much did the decibels reduce. That's then averaged out, and a standard deviation is removed from that to get your advertised SNR. Okay, so across a range of those 16 people in the sample, you will have, let's go with an SNR level of 30. That's effectively your reduction rating. So if you're currently at 100 decibels, 30 will reduce it down to 70, which means we're safe. Okay, so the benchmark, essentially the minimum threshold set by the Occupational Health and Safety Act is at 80 decibels. Provision of hearing protection must be made. So then it's optional. As Dylan, you can say, I feel more susceptible to injury, I need to wear an earplug. It has to be provided for.
Is that at the 80 decibel mark?
At 80 decibels.
Below 80 decibels, we don't need anything?
Below 80 decibels, again, if it's something you would like to use, you may.
Okay.
You may request it of your employer, but at 80, according to laws, they would need to provide.
And it probably, because it's not necessarily going to cause damage below 80?
Correct. So as far as we know, 80 is where we start to see some trouble start. Okay. Really at 85, and 80 is the precautionary level, the action level they call it. Okay, so it's optional. At 85, the employee has to wear hearing protection. Okay, so now we know at 85 decibels, that's what we know is the threshold. 85 decibels for an 8-hour shift. Essentially, if you're exposed to that, you will experience noise-induced hearing loss. Okay.
Over a long period still, but it is dangerous and damaging your hearing.
Correctly, over years, but I mean, the threshold is calculated as far as an 8-hour shift is concerned. Yeah. Right, so if for example, you are working for 4 hours, that threshold would change from 85 up to 88 decibels. So we use the 8-hour shift because that's
I think it's just
the norm.
Important that people realize that even though it's a little bit louder than maybe the 80 decibel mark, you're not going to next weekend not hear.
Correct.
In 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and I mean, I don't know about you, but I prefer to be able to hear when I'm older so that one day when there's grandchildren, you can hear them. I mean, that's not something you want to eliminate from your life.
100%. So when we're born, we're essentially born with 40,000 stereocilia. That's the hair cells within the cochlea. And that's where the magic of hearing happens. So we interpret the world around us through these stereocilia. And when exposed to high noise levels, it's vibrations that move through the cochlea with more energy that damage these hair cells. All right, so as you're exposed to these high noise levels for lengthy periods of time, you could lose as much as one hair cell, depending on that exposure and duration. Losing one hair cell, you're not going to notice or perceive a difference in your hearing. And that actually leads to other problems. Sometimes people will start in industry in a job where it is noticeable. There's a little bit of pain, there's a little bit of awareness around high noise levels that are causing a problem of sorts. And 3, 4, 5, 6 months into the job, you lose that first line of defense of your hair cells, and you feel like you're less sensitive to the noise. And that's only because you've now already lost a certain amount of hearing. So less is being interpreted. So you're feeling slightly less sensitive to it. But in actual fact, you've lost a bit of your hearing.
And it's actually, I think you alluded to it earlier in the episode where you said you would feel more comfortable. It's the inverse of feeling in danger of losing. And I think that's what you're alluding to, right? Where, okay, it's not hurting me as much anymore. I'm getting used to it. Actually, no.
My body's adapting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not adapting. So if you want to run a marathon a year from now and you start to train, your body will adapt. You will generate muscle and endurance over that period, and you will be more conditioned to running longer distances. Your hair cells do not work the same way. If they're exposed to noise that's over the threshold, you lose those hair cells and they do not grow back. It's entirely irreversible. So your body cannot either recover from it. All right. So I use the practical example. My wife tends to buy me special shampoos to bring back some of my hair cells up here. And I say to my wife, well, love, thank you. But regardless of what I try, these hair cells aren't coming back. And it's pretty much the same with it.
And I assume you're not going to try put it in your ears either.
No, exactly. So unfortunately, sadly, once it's lost, it's gone.
Yeah.
But like I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly simple. So the calculation, essentially, you want to be getting that noise level down to the level between 70 and 80. And there's a small derating factor. We won't get into the detail that we need to consider just for user error. So we build in a slight amount of fat in the calculation, and I'll share that document in the Toolbox talk so that it's available for download, the exact calculation employers should use. But essentially, you want to get that residual figure down with the SNR rating.
Okay.
So you reduce that number by the SNR, and the goal is to get it between 70 and 80. Okay.
Cool.
Your next step would be to consider practical environment issues. So is there a lot of dirt? Should you then be using a foam earplug that could attract that dirt and cause certain discomforts? Or should you be going for a rubber reusable product that's easily washable?
Yeah.
Does the wearer have a existing condition inside of the ear canal? In which case, an earmuff would be more appropriate because you don't need to insert the product and go through that discomfort. So sadly, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it is an easy solution, an effective solution, if we just know some utmost basics about how to protect ourselves.
Awesome.
Okay. Last two steps essentially would be your training, your education. So Occupational Health and Safety Act says we have to give training to the wearer. This has to happen once a year by a competent person and needs to cover a certain amount of topics, how to insert the earplug correctly, how to remove it, how to clean it, how to dispose of it, how to store it, basics like that. So, and that's where we get involved, and we offer that service free of charge. All of our customers get free annual hearing conservation training, and that's just part of the service, and as you mentioned earlier, the passion of what we do.
Yeah.
So your very last step would be your health surveillance. All right. So if there is already a pre-recognized risk of hearing loss at this business, when employees start their first day, so at commencement of employment, they need to do their baseline audiometric testing to understand the start point. All right. To what degree has this person already lost their hearing? So you know exactly where to start.
Yeah.
And if it shifts from there, you know, okay, something's wrong. So from start date to a year from now, there's been no shift. Everything is in place and everything is working. If there is a shift, we need to put in some certain actions, whether that's training or a different product solution, that would be determined at the time. That testing needs to happen every year. So annually, there needs to be a baseline audiometric test, as well as on exit of employment at that business. And that documentation needs to be held for years thereafter.
Thank you for joining us, and I hope this episode added value to you. If you are experiencing any safety challenges on your sites and require any additional information, please do leave us a message on LinkedIn via Protector Safety Gears page, or alternatively follow the link below and share a message with us, because maybe it can create value or a valuable conversation for future episodes. Be sure to also follow us on LinkedIn. There will be some valuable information shared from today's discussion.